Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special cozy horror with me, Dr. Plague. As fall rolls out its splendor for us, we are reminded that it's the spooky time of the year, a time for ghosts and ghouls, and not just the ones that are asking for candy. Let's hear some great Halloween stories, both old and new, and see if we can't get you in the Halloween spirit before the time is upon us. I've made for you a bit of a Halloween sandwich for our first jaunt. It is equal parts sorrow and scares. So let's begin on the heel with a sad little tale that many of you will remember. Let's invite in our Halloween visitor.
Come on, Dad, let's go! Lily stomped a slipper-clad foot on the sidewalk as she looked back at her father. She was ready to go trick-or-treating, and it seemed like nothing but Josh was standing in the way of her sweet treats. He was sitting on the front step of his childhood home, a well-loved cul-de-sac teeming with costumed children. The moon hung overhead, a ghostly sickle that presided over this Halloween night, and her dad was sitting with his back against the smooth stairs, as he found his eyes tracking the multitudes as they passed. The children laughed and screamed as they stalked by, the street a sea of superheroes, video game characters, colorful animals, and everything in between. He let his eyes drift past the excited pageantry, though. He was looking for one shape in particular. Josh's mom smiled at him, slipping her hand into Lily's and giving her a little tug. "Come on, hun. Your dad's waiting for someone. We'll go trick-or-treating while he waits." Lily looked interested. "Who are you waiting for, Daddy?" Of course, she wouldn't have remembered from last year. She'd been excited about trick-or-treating, showing off her Wonder Woman costume, and swinging between her father and her mother's hands as they walked. However, Laura was 6 months pregnant this year, and had opted out of the hour drive to get to his mother's house. She had smiled at Josh knowingly as he left, and told him to tell her hi for her. Lily's grandmother smoothed her hair as it sat under the tall princess hat. "It's just an old friend, dear. Your father meets him here every year." "Well, you're gonna miss out on the candy," Lily said, her tone stating firmly that she wouldn't be sharing if he didn't come. Josh smiled. "That's okay, Lily. You go and have fun with Grandma, okay?" Lily just shrugged, her grandmother's tugging hand finally leading her towards the waiting cacophony of spooky delights. She glanced back as they walked onto the street, but was soon lost in the crowd and probably wouldn't remember anything about this conversation until next year. Josh leaned back, getting comfy as he waited for him to arrive. He did this every year, every Halloween after that first so many years ago. In many ways, the visits were what Josh looked forward to the most about Halloween. Sure, the candy was nice, the costumes were great, but seeing his friend was why he always came home for Halloween. No matter where Josh was, no matter what he was doing, he always came home for Halloween. This was the night he got to see him. This was the night that Josh got to see Snarf again. Snarf had been a mutt. He was a bull terrier mixed with a basset hound mixed with God only knew what else. They had grown up together. Snarf was just a puppy when Josh had got him, and he was Josh's best friend for many years. When Josh thought back on that time in his life, he was glad he had gotten Snarf when he did. Kindergarten had been a difficult time for him, and his sheltered upbringing hadn't really prepared him for suddenly being around so many children. He was awkward, and not what you would call popular. He had thick glasses, was overweight, and his isolation had made him painfully shy. The other kids who had gone to daycare and Cub Scouts and T-ball together, took one look at him and dismissed him as a social outcast. It was tough, being unwanted at the age of 5. His mom thought a dog might help Josh's confidence, or at least ease some of the loneliness. In many ways, Josh believed his mother had recognized that the funk he was in was partially her fault, and was trying to make amends. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and often Josh was left in the care of his grandmother. She loved him and always doted on him, but she wasn't always up for the games a 5-year-old would be interested in. Thinking about it over the years, Josh often thought that Snarf was a way for her to alleviate some of the guilt about leaving him alone. Whatever the reason, he had loved her for it. His mother found Snarf at the Humane Society. He was a little smiling ball of fluff, And when he put his feet against the glass, she had known that he would be perfect. He had been waiting for Josh when she had come to pick him up that day. And the boy's surprise had turned to joy as the wet puppy tongue slid over his face. They sat in the back seat the whole way home, the dog's head against his stomach, panting happily as Josh scratched him behind the ears. He was that rare animal whose temperament never led him to jump up on people or bark for no reason. His accidents were few and far between, and he was easy to house train. They called him Snarf because he had a deviation in his nose that caused him to make a snarfing sound rather than a proper bark. He was the best dog, the only one Josh had ever owned, and Josh had flourished with the help of his new companion. Snarf had gotten him out of the house, helping him shed some of the baby fat that had made him the subject of so much ridicule. He had also been a great icebreaker to help Josh introduce himself to some of the neighborhood kids. By the time he had entered first grade, Josh had a few pals, but none of them could hold a candle to his friendship with that wiggling little mass of fur and ears. He was eternally thankful for the time he'd gotten with Snarf, but it would never have been enough. Josh dumped a fistful of candy into each of their buckets, and the trio of Disney princesses said thank you as they ran to the next house in a flurry of skirts and sneakers. A pirate wandered up and gave him his best "Arg!" Josh rewarded him with a couple of full-size Snicker bars, and he thanked him before wobbling off on his fake peg leg. Josh kept scanning the crowd, unsure what was taking his friend so long this year. He was usually here by now, but he had been late before. He sat up a little as he saw a small ghost, 4 legs poking from below a bedsheet. When it turned and wagged its tail at a larger ghost who was walking behind it, Josh got comfortable again. He sat scanning around, hoping it wouldn't be too much longer. He'd sit here all night if he had to, though. Josh would sit here till midnight if it bought him 5 minutes with his buddy. Josh had Snarf for 5 years, and those 5 years were filled with mostly good times between a boy and his dog. Snarf was never a chewer or prone to digging holes, and Josh couldn't remember ever having to fill in a hole or run after him as he chased a cat. Snarf also knew where the boundaries of his home were, and Josh never saw him run out of the yard or get in the road after a car. He was a good boy, and the neighborhood loved him. He would likely have a long and happy life if it hadn't been for Josh. To this day, he blamed himself for what had happened to Snarf. It had all started when Reggie moved into the neighborhood. Reggie moved in when Josh was 10, and his family took up residence in the Cranston house. Mr. Cranston had died about a month before, and though his family hadn't been neighbors with them, Mr. Cranston was a nice old man who was known to the whole neighborhood. He had always had the best yard displays for Christmas or Halloween, and he had given out the best candy to trick-or-treaters. When the ambulance came to take him away one night, everyone had hoped for the best, but poor Mr. Cranston had died of a heart attack. Luckily, he had been on the phone with his daughter when it had happened, or who knows when they would have found him. So when a moving van came up the street bound for Mr. Cranston's old house, Josh and his friends had hopped on their bikes and went to check it out. Josh had a group of friends that he hung out with then. Terry, Walt, and Patrick lived in the same neighborhood as he did, and they'd been friends for years. When the new boy was seen unpacking boxes from the van, they introduced themselves and welcomed him to the neighborhood. He was a big kid, tall and muscular, and Josh had gotten a weird feeling about him almost at once. "I'm Josh," he said, extending a hand. "We were just about to go play some ball if you're interested." "Reggie," the boy said, squeezing his hand a little too hard, almost like he meant to hurt him. "Yeah, sounds like that might be fun." One short conversation was enough to let the boys know that Reggie's interests were different than theirs. Most of them had agreed later that they felt he probably wasn't going to be a good fit for the group, and not just because of his attitude. He had scoffed at their comic books, asked if they were babies when they talked about action figures, and when he'd said that baseball sounded fun, it made everyone shiver a little. He was large, a sneering boy, and they all decided to keep their distance from him as they said their goodbyes and pedaled away. But of course, Reggie lived on the block, so he inevitably found a place in their games. He was never invited, always just sort of invited himself. He made the teams uneven, and no one seemed to want him to play, but the boys were too polite to tell him to buzz off. That was how it started, but Josh and his friends had regretted giving in so easily almost at once. They'd been correct in their assumptions that he liked to hurt people. He had nearly broken Patrick's wrist when he fouled him during basketball. He had shoved Terry off his bike during a bike race, skinning both his hands and his knees. And every time he threw a football to you, you either caught it or you wound up with a bloody nose. By the end of the summer, their politeness had turned into fear, and they were all too afraid of him to tell him to go away when he came to invite himself to their games. They were playing baseball when it happened. Reggie had seen them setting up and inserted himself into the game, as he usually did. Terry sighed loudly, covering it up with a cough when Reggie got close enough to hear them. Josh and Terry had tried to explain that letting him play would make the teams uneven, but Reggie didn't really care. He made it pretty clear that he was going to play whether they liked it or not, and there wasn't really anything that could be done about it. Snarf had walked up then, snuffling Josh's hand for pats, and Josh had dropped to his knees to give him scratches. The dog accepted the attention, but his eyes never left Reggie, and Josh could see the mistrust in them. Reggie was the only person that Josh had ever seen elicit a growl from the usually good-natured dog. Reggie had quickly learned not to come into Josh's yard, as Snarf would not tolerate him. This was fine with Josh, because unlike the others, whose houses Reggie frequently visited, Snarf had kept him out of his yard and his fingers off of Josh's stuff. Josh was also careful to keep Snarf inside when he wasn't out there to supervise him. He had seen the way Reggie's piggy little eyes narrowed when he looked at the dog, and Josh knew enough to be cautious. He wished he'd just put Snarf inside when he started growling that day, but he had pushed it away and hoped it would help Reggie know that they wouldn't tolerate any funny business. The game had gone about as well as expected until the 5th inning. Reggie and Terry had been team captains, and Reggie had won the coin toss, so he got to pick first. Reggie and Walt had been on a team, and Terry and Josh had been on another, with Patrick acting as an umpire or standing in if someone got tired. Reggie had belted a few down the road, and he and Walt were winning 7-3. The trade-off for Reggie's freakish strength was that he wasn't particularly coordinated. He missed a few fly balls and let a few slide between his legs, so Josh and Terry weren't as far behind as they could have been. There had been some good-natured shoving, as good-natured as it ever got with Reggie, but there was no real violence to speak of. Snarf had gone to lounge on his lawn, and the boys were actually having fun, despite 4 of them having to keep an eye on the 5th. It all went south when Reggie took the plate again. He cracked it a good one, and Josh and Terry prepared to get out of the way as Reggie ran. Reggie did not believe in dropping the bat after hitting the ball, as the bruises on the boys' ankles could attest. The bat made a loud crack as it hit the ball, and as it sailed off down the street, Josh made a dash for it. Reggie came running around first base, Terry hovering between second and third, as Patrick stood on the manhole that was serving as the pitcher's mound. Patrick had quickly figured out that a third might be required when the teams took the field, and had agreed to be the pitcher and the umpire. Walt was whistling as Reggie ran for second, and the ball bounced once before Josh grabbed it. He had turned to throw it when he heard Terry yell out in pain. Terry, Walt would later tell him, had tripped Reggie as he ran past, and the big boy had fallen and skinned his hands and knees. Reggie had come up mad, cracking him in the stomach with the bat, and towering over him as the fallen boy prepared to have his skull caved in. Josh dropped the ball, sprinting towards the pair, as Reggie lifted the bat up to hit Terry again. Walt ran from the sidelines as Patrick came shouting and telling Reggie to knock it off. All 3 of them knew they wouldn't make it before he hit Terry, and they were just hoping to get there before he hit him again. Fast as they were, though, Snarf was faster. Snarf hit Reggie in the back, sending him reeling forward and dropping him into the street a second time. He stood over Terry protectively, snarling and showing his teeth at Reggie's back. Reggie was getting back up, shaking his head, but Snarf didn't seem to want to attack him. He just stood over Terry, the boy still frozen in surprise and fear. Reggie got back on his feet, his knuckles turning white against the bat's handle as he squeezed. Josh saw him turn in slow motion, the boy still running for Terry, but it made no difference. Snarf was staring daggers at Reggie, but when Josh called his name, he looked towards him, tail wagging. The bat crashed down on the dog, and the pitiful noise he made sent a shard of glass through Josh's guts. Walt and Patrick arrived in time to grab Terry under the arms and drag him away from the scene. Josh hit Reggie as hard as he could around the waist, dropping him to the concrete a 3rd time and sending the bat clinking across the asphalt with an angry wooden clitter. Reggie hit his head on the concrete, and as the wind oofed out of him, Josh punched him in the face. He saw Reggie's eyes glaze a little with the impact, his lips quivering in surprise as his head bounced off the pavement again. Josh got off him, picking up the bat as Reggie tried to get his bearings. Josh pointed the bat at Reggie, yelling at him to get out of here. He told him not to come near him, his friends, or his dog again. He said some of the adult words he knew, the cusses sounding high and whispery as he fought back tears. Reggie got up on an elbow, grinning at Josh as he seemed to dare him to do anything. When the other 3 boys came up behind him, though, Reggie realized that he might be in trouble if he decided to act in haste. He could take 1 kid, bat or no bat, but 4 kids would probably beat the tar out of him. So, he backed up on his hands before breaking into a run and fleeing for home. Josh would never feel bad about what he had done to Reggie, but looking back at that moment, he would feel a lot of shame. The shame came from letting his anger blind him to Snarf's pain, from letting his need to dispel Reggie separate him from his dog when he needed him most. It didn't matter, though. None of it really mattered. When Josh turned back around, it was already too late. Josh found himself glaring at Reggie's old house as he watched a pair of Transformers walk off with their chocolate. The house was occupied now, but it had been empty for quite some time after the family had moved away. That had happened later, months after he'd killed Snarf, and those months felt like an eternity at the time. Reggie's parents had refused to believe that their son had killed Snarf, and they seemed angrier that Josh and his friends had beaten up their son. When they threatened to call the police, after Reggie had come home with scrapes and bruises, Josh's mom had just dropped the whole thing. Reggie's parents are threatening to sue us for hospital costs, and I can't afford something like that, sweetie. I'm sorry about Snarf, but if we call the cops, we'll be in trouble as well. She told Josh this, and he had seethed in his 10-year-old heart. He saw a big blonde kid with a crew cut, dressed in a karate gi, and he almost didn't hand him anything. Reggie was still on his mind, and this kid could have passed for him once upon a time. His eyes, they didn't really have that evil gleam in them, though, and Josh smiled at him as he handed him some candy. The kid threw him a mock salute and rejoined the throng still parading up the street. Reggie had been bigger, meaner, but in the end, Reggie had not been braver. Josh had been inconsolable after the death of Snarf. He had pretended to be sick for a week, and his mother had just let him pretend in the wake of his sorrow. His grandma stayed with him, often just sitting with Josh while he wallowed in his misery. She never pushed him as he moped around the house, just letting him feel his hurt as she waited for it to pass. He mostly just lay on the couch and watched TV, not really paying attention, just liking the noise. As they sat there one afternoon, her arm draped around him, she told Josh something he would never forget. I know you miss your friend, but you can't let his death be the end of your life. You have to live it for both of you now. It's what he would have wanted. Josh looked up at her with big swimmy eyes. But I miss him. She smiled. I know you do, but it's almost Halloween, a time when they say the ghosts of our loved ones can walk the earth again. Maybe, just maybe, his love will be great enough to bring him back to you. That made him think. If ghosts and spirits could walk the earth on Halloween, then maybe Snarf could too. Josh spent the rest of the month in a little better mood, waiting for Halloween night so he could see if Snarf would come and visit. His mom had to work on Halloween, but Grandma was home with him and said that she could take him out trick-or-treating if he wanted. Josh didn't want to go out, though. He sat in his room and watched out the window, hoping to see Snarf as he ran up the front walk. When his friends came to see him, they were all costumed and looking for him to join their group. They begged him to trick-or-treat with them. They hadn't seen him in months. He hadn't come out to play since the baseball game, and they missed him. Each of them was dressed as a different Power Ranger, and Terry said his grandma had sent him a second costume if Josh wanted to use it. Josh had a feeling that Terry had bought it in case he decided to come out with them, and though touched, Josh still didn't want to go. He might miss Snarf, and he wanted to see him if he came back. Once again, Grandma had the answer. I'll keep an eye out for him, and I'll tell him to stay if he comes to see you while you're gone. Josh was hesitant, but after some coaxing, he put on the costume and left with his group of friends. They had made him the Blue Ranger, his favorite Power Ranger, and as they set out into the night, he felt a little better. Josh had missed his friends over the past few weeks, but after what had happened, he just couldn't bring himself to see them. Going out with him now made him feel a lot better, and they spent a few blissful hours filling their sacks with candy. It would have been a perfect Halloween if Reggie hadn't come. Josh started noticing lights going out in the cul-de-sac as it ticked closer to 10. The kids who were present were becoming older, the little kids already turning in, and he furrowed his brow as Snarf still hadn't appeared. He felt like he had on that first Halloween after Snarf's death, looking for him as he'd walked the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Josh heard a bark and snapped his head to the side expectantly. He frowned, though, when he saw it was just a lab in a bee costume. Its owner came hurrying after him, followed by a football player heading for the next house. A pair of ninjas wandered up next, and Josh sighed as he dug them out some candy. Surely he wouldn't stand him up. He hadn't stood him up that night, so why start now? It was almost 10 by the time the lights started going out on that long-ago Halloween. The street began to empty, and Josh's bag was beginning to get heavy. He and his friends had bulging sacks of candy, and they were sitting on the sidewalk and trading. Josh had started out looking for Snarf, glancing around as they walked against the tide of excited children. In those 2 hours, he had gotten a reprieve from his sadness, but as the night wound down, the old feelings were starting to fester again. He told his friends that he had to get home, and Josh started looking for him again as he moved through the thinning group of trick-or-treaters. He wanted to get home so he could see if Snarf had come back, which was probably why he missed Reggie. When the egg hit him in the side of the head, Josh staggered under the impact. His ear rang, and he thought he was bleeding when his gloved hand came away wet. One look told him it was just egg yolk, though. He looked across the street and saw Reggie grinning at him from under a lamppost. He wasn't in costume, dressed in his baseball shorts and a tank top, but he did have a silver bat in his hand, tossing an egg up and catching it in his other as he smiled. Josh froze when he saw that he was staring at him, realizing how vulnerable he was out here alone with his house 3 street lights away. "Been waiting for you to come out. We got unfinished business, Four Eyes. I think I owe you the same sort of beating I gave your stupid dog," he chuckled, swinging the bat experimentally. Josh stepped off the curve towards him, angry at what he had said, but thought better of it immediately. That metal bat could cave his skull in, and Reggie was pretty good at swinging bats. He glanced towards his house instead. 3 streetlights didn't seem so far, and Josh thought he could probably run faster than Reggie if it came to it. It seemed it was either run or sit here and get killed by this psycho. The choice seemed pretty obvious. He made the first light, easily outstriping Reggie, but Josh heard him getting closer as he moved under the second light. Reggie slapped the light pole with the bat as he went by, and it made a hollow thunk sound as it connected. Josh started to panic when he heard it. What if he caught him? What if he killed him? Would he die in the street like Snarf had? Josh wished that Snarf was here as his tears streamed down his face. He would have protected him. Snarf would have stopped Reggie from hurting him. If Josh hadn't distracted him that day, maybe Snarf would be here to help him. His house was in sight when the second egg cracked him in the back of the head. He stumbled as the egg connected. Josh had forgotten about the eggs. Though it hadn't been thrown very hard, it surprised him. Josh staggered into the fence that separated his yard from the neighbor's and crashed against it with a loud thunk. His head connected with the boards as he fell, and his head swam a little as the cheap plastic mask broke into pieces. Josh was reaching out in slow motion, moving his hands and legs like someone wading through mud. He rolled onto his butt as he prepared to take off again, but it was too late. Reggie loomed over him, the streetlight gleaming off his bat. "Looks like I caught you, Four Eyes," Reggie said, raising the bat. "Say hi to your dog for me when you see him." Josh pushed up against the fence, hoping it would fall backwards, knowing it wasn't going anywhere. Reggie raised the bat high, the metal twinkling as the light made galaxies of starbursts. Josh closed his eyes, preparing for the blow that would end his life prematurely. When the growl split the night, though, he opened his eyes and looked between Reggie's splayed legs. Reggie had turned his head to look at the shadowy crevice between the house and the fence that now stopped Josh from escaping. Between the structures stood a snarling, red-eyed creature that seemed to fill the space with its shadowy mass. Reggie took a sidelong step away from Josh, the beast snarling hugely as it took a single thunderous step towards him. Josh felt his breath hitch as Reggie stepped into the street, and the looming thing lowered its head and rumbled. Josh's brain couldn't fathom it. This nightmare creature had appeared in his neighborhood out of nowhere, and was now seconds away from ending both him and his bully. When it loosed that single ear-splitting snarl, Josh put his head between his knees and pushed his palms against his ears. He sat in the darkness, screaming against his legs as he prepared to be devoured. Josh had assumed that he would die that night after running from the hulking brute, but never like this. When the warm tongue slid over his hair, he cracked the back of his head against the fence, trying to escape again. Then he opened his eyes, gasping like a trapped animal, to find Snarf's panting, grinning face. Reggie was gone, Bat lying in the street, and Josh wrapped his arms around his lost friend. He laughed as Snarf licked his cheek. He pressed his face against the dog's familiar short fur, and Josh's sadness melted away as Snarf's doggy tongue bombarded him. That was how his mom had found him, laughing with his back against the fence as her headlights dissipated the ghostly dog licking him as he'd done so many times before. Snarf had come back and visited him on Halloween night every year since. His mother didn't come right out and say it at first. She was upset about his injuries, but she told Josh later that she had seen Snarf for a few seconds before her headlights hit him. After he told her what had happened with Reggie, she called the police. She gave them the bat, told them how Reggie had been a problem this summer, and started a process of having a restraining order placed against him. She was tired of being bullied by Reggie's parents, as tired as Josh was of being bullied by Reggie. Reggie's family moved shortly before the order was finalized. Josh never saw him again, and was happier for it. Josh watched his mother walk up the front lawn now, Lily in her arms as she sleepily held onto her sack of candy. She was stumbling on the way back. "I think we're going to have some cocoa if you'd like to join us." "Give me a few more minutes, Mom. I think he's just running late this year." Mom smiled. "Take all the time you need, dear." She walked inside, leaving him on the stoop. The street was emptying, only a few stragglers heading for home, and Josh glanced around furtively. Where was Snarf? Had he forgotten about his old friend? 20 years was a long time to visit someone who wasn't a little boy anymore. Maybe he had... Josh dropped the bowl of candy when that ghostly cold nose prodded his hand. He looked down to find Snarf, tail wagging, as he smiled up at him from the front lawn of the house he had loved so much. Josh wrapped his arms around him, and it felt like coming home again.
Always such a powerful story, and a reminder to be good to those we love while we have them. Moving right along to a Halloween classic, let's delve into an area that I always love exploring this time of year. Kids telling tales around a fire. So, let's hear about a tale that becomes a little too real for our intrepid group of Halloween campers. Let's hear about The Whistler.
When I was a kid, I had a pretty typical suburban childhood. White picket fences, ticky-tacky suburban houses, endless concrete for my friends and I to ride our bikes on, and the only strangers we saw were the occasional drifters or travelers that wandered through our town. My dad worked at the steel mill. My mom was a homemaker. I remember afternoons off from school filled with bike rides and trips to the arcade, Boy Scout meetings, and exploring Stokes Woods that lay just off the secluded neighborhood we all lived in. Stokes Woods was where my friends and I had so many firsts. It was honestly the first bit of real freedom we had. We spent summer days exploring, making maps, and setting up camps that would be found later to our great amusement. It was our first brush with death, too, finding birds or animal carcasses on the trail. We poked at them with sticks and oohed at the bugs that crawled out. We never guessed that one day we might share their fate. I was in the woods the first time I swore, yelling, "Damn it!" as I skinned my knee when I was 8. I was in those woods the first time I saw a naked lady, the glossy pages of Terry's dad's Playboy gripped in my sweaty hand as we sat around the campfire when we were 11. It hosted my first camping trip. It was the first place I was allowed to camp alone. Well, with Terry and Reggie, but it was our first time out alone at night. It was also where we found the treehouse. The treehouse was a relic of kids gone by. It was in a big old tree set into a clearing, a fire pit dug in its shadow. It had a dumbwaiter to pull things up, and a rope ladder to climb up through a trapdoor. It was built in pieces. There was a wall inside with the signatures of kids who had added to it, complete with dates when they had completed them. When we came across it one afternoon, our 9-year-old eyes grew big with wonder. We knew we had found something special that day. Over the next few weeks, we replaced the rope ladder, cleaned out the fire pit, and replaced the dumbwaiter rope. We painted it too, finding some paint at the junkyard and painting the faded treasure in a wash of purple and brown and gold. We added a bike rack, again with the wood from the junkyard, and signed our names and dates on the wall when the project was done. The easy trip to and from the junkyard made me believe that the treehouse might have been constructed from the things they found there. We asked Old Man Macy, the caretaker, and he said that kids had been coming and going from the dump for years. He said every few years some kids would come along and take wood and pipes and things for special projects they did out in the woods. He was honestly glad they had been putting it to good use. We'd been playing and camping and using the treehouse for a couple of years when Terry suggested a Halloween sleepover. It's on a Friday. We can camp out in the treehouse and eat candy and tell scary stories. I thought it sounded like a great idea, and my parents agreed. 3 kids alone in the woods may seem weird to some of you, but the town we lived in was pretty rural. Our town had a population of about 1,200, and crime was almost non-existent. Besides the odd traveler that sometimes blew through, you knew your neighbors pretty well. We had camped in the woods for the last 2 years, and the Boy Scouts had taught all of us how to camp safely and not burn down the woods. That night, we all hit the street as soon as the lamps came on. We set out with our pillowcases in hand and embarked on a sweet journey to collect the most candy. As always, we had a theme, and we were all dressed as the Avengers when we went out trick-or-treating. I was Hawkeye, bow slung over my shoulder, handmade costume and cheap mask covering my eyes. Reggie was the Hulk, body painted green and absurd rubber hands over his real ones. Terry was Captain America, his store-bought costume topped off by a trash can lid that he had painted a star on. We moved from house to house, striking poses and delighting adults as they filled our pillowcases with candy. By the time the porch lights started going out, we had bulging sacks ready to burst from all the candy we'd gotten. We stopped at our homes, dropping off a little excess candy and getting our camping stuff. We told our parents where we were going, and my mom kissed me goodnight and told me to come straight home if there was an emergency. And with that, we set off. We walked the familiar trails into the woods. Our backpacks were bulging with our candy sacks, and the night was lit by a full and ghostly moon. Terry and Reggie talked excitedly about the candy, wanting to tell ghost stories as we ate it. But I kept getting distracted. I could swear there was a noise out in the woods, a bird or a high-pitched wind. As we moved towards the treehouse, it seemed to follow us. The other 2 were oblivious, but the sounds made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It came closer and closer, never quite reaching us, but seeming to pass us sometimes. I heard it behind us, heard it in front of us, and how the others could remain oblivious of it was beyond me. When the treehouse rose up to greet us, it was a real relief. In the light of the full moon, though, it looked ghostly and strange. I had thought the noise would cease to be an issue once we arrived, but it only seemed to get worse. As we loaded our bags on the dumbwaiter, I could swear the whistling still surrounded us. I rushed them a little, gaining some grumpy looks, but I wanted to be out of the woods and into the safety of the treehouse. Once we were safe inside, lanterns on and candy spilled on the floor, I began to feel at ease. This was our sanctuary. Nothing bad could happen to us here. We were children who had yet to experience loss or any real trauma. We were secure in our knowledge that our parents would still protect us from anything, no matter how bad it got. We were foolish, but children are supposed to be foolish, I guess. Reggie was halfway through one of his full-size candy bars the Hudsons had been passing out when Terry suggested we start the ghost stories. Terry loved scary stories, and he usually had a pretty good collection of them from the internet or wherever. Reggie pulled a beanbag chair over from the corner, and I dragged a camp chair over so I could join the group of lanterns. Typically, we would tell our stories around the fire pit, but I think we all sensed that tonight it would be better to be inside. Halloween was unique somehow. It was best to be inside after dark. Terry brought the flashlight up under his chin, tilting the light knob down on the lantern and grinning at us ghoulishly. "This is a true story. I swear it on my life," he said, before beginning his story. He told us a story about a kid plagued by the ghost of a hobo that he and his friends had accidentally killed. They had been playing a trick on him, and he had choked to death on a sandwich. After he died, the boy kept seeing him around, in windows or on street corners, but his friends hadn't believed him. Then, while the boys were at a sleepover, the ghost struck. I found myself distracted as he told the story, though. The wind blew against our treehouse, creaking it in the branches of the old tree. But beneath the wind, there was a weird sound. That same whistling was coming from outside, a high-pitched keening that was not altogether tuneless. As I listened to it, it almost seemed to move through the surrounding trees as Terry wove his tale. Terry came to the end of his story, and the boy's friends died badly. The boy escaped the sleepover and ran for his home. The ghostly hobo dogged his heels, screaming his name as he chased him through the quiet streets. But the boy had made it home and slammed the door in his rotting face. He had leaned against it, safe at last, but as the banging began, he remembered one important fact. His parents were gone, Terry said, grinning in the flashlight beam. He might have made it home, but he was still at the mercy of the ghostly apparition. Terry told us how the door had bowed inward, the ragged hands pushing the wood like wax paper, but I felt my attention dragged away again. I could still hear the whistling, closer now, and I could swear there was another noise too. Rustling leaves maybe, or leaves crackling underfoot. Was someone outside the treehouse? And as Patches pushed at his door, trying to catch him, the boy snuck out the window and disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Terry seemed to notice then that I wasn't really paying attention. "Oh, come on. That was a great story." "Huh?" I asked. Oh yeah. Something was just distracting me outside. Reggie looked quizzically at me. What was it? I thought I heard someone outside moving around in the leaves. Terry turned to look at the bare window, and Reggie walked over to look out into the inky blackness. The moon cast an odd light over his face, but as he scanned the ground, it gave away no sudden surprise. He shrugged his already broad shoulders and returned to his beanbag chair. He reached for a candy bar and started unwrapping the silvery foil. "Nothing there," he said after Terry and I stared at him for a second. "Must have been the wind." Terry had begun another story about a shadowy creature that lived in a stairwell. As he laid out the narrative, though, I could hear the whistling again. It wormed into my consciousness, spinning through the trees outside like a drunken bird. I could hear the leaves crunching again, the wind making them rustle like skeletal wind chimes. And suddenly, I too wanted to go to the window and look out into the night. I was trying to listen to Terry's story, but the more I tried to pay attention to it, the more I heard the noises from below. Terry looked miffed when I interrupted his story to drag up the rope ladder. I latched the hatch and came back to find him with his arms crossed and an indignant look on his face. "Think you can do a better story? Well then, hotshot, have at it." He tossed the flashlight at me, and I caught it by reflex. I thought about it for a minute and realized I did have a story I could tell. Maybe by getting it out, I could alleviate the fear that had been consuming me. I was ruining my Halloween campout, and for what? Some noise outside the treehouse? It was probably just a raccoon or something that we had spooked when we arrived. My unease had given me the perfect story, though. So, these three kids were walking in the woods. They were going camping, and were going to a familiar spot in the woods to set up. They left their homes at dusk, wanting to camp out under the stars in just their sleeping bags. Their parents told them that if anything went wrong, they could come home and sleep there. But the boys had done this 100 times, and felt that they knew the woods like the back of their hand. They felt like nothing in the woods could surprise them. But they were wrong. Terry sneered, but he sat close to the lantern and listened nonetheless. Reggie opened another candy bar, the story drawing him in as the stories almost always did. Reggie didn't really seem to like scary things. He was kind of a fraidy cat. But he liked stories. He would sit and listen, getting more and more terrified, but always beg for another when you were done. They walked towards the determined campsite, talking animatedly about the s'mores they would make and the scary stories they would tell. One of them kept hearing something as they walked. He could hear a snap of a twig, the crunch of a leaf, and it made him wary. He told his friends, but they shrugged it off as nothing. It was late afternoon, the sun was setting, and the animals were coming out to forage. They were probably just hearing animals moving around in the dry leaves. The two of them went back to walking, talking between themselves, but the third kept listening, kept looking over his shoulder to see what lay behind. Terry and Reggie were paying attention, Terry a little begrudgingly. Reggie's eyes were large and starey as he listened. As I told the story, I almost thought I could hear the leaves crackling outside, the wind in the trees rattling the dying year's foliage against the limbs, and a low whistle could be heard outside. It was tuneless and wafting as it warbled across my sanity. I knew just what was stalking these kids through the woods as I began to spin their tale. He kept asking them to listen, telling them it was important, but they wouldn't listen to him. They kept walking, kept talking, and all the while the crunching leaves and the rustling of limbs followed them, getting closer and closer. The boy became afraid. The steps sounded large, but he couldn't see anything in the trees as they proceeded down the trail. One of the others finally yelled at him, telling him to stop being stupid and just enjoy the trip. There was nothing out there. No one but he could hear it. He was being dumb. He needed to relax. I paused for dramatic effect, seeing Terry roll his eyes at the description of the boy in the story. That's when they heard the whistling. And I imagined I could still hear the whistling outside the treehouse. It was getting closer and closer as I told the story. Was the story drawing it in? Was I calling it to the treehouse? But by now, though, I couldn't stop myself. The story needed to be told, and I had become a conduit for it. I would tell it to the end, even if the whistler came right up the tree after us. They all froze when they heard the whistling. This was no wind through the boughs of a tree. This was a tuneless, monotonous whistling that cut across the dying afternoon like a sickle through wheat. It was behind them, seemingly on the trail, and they could hear it getting closer and closer. They began to make their way towards the campsite, walking a little faster, but all three looked over their shoulder now. They were all made uneasy by the whistling, and they all wanted to put some distance between themselves and it. My friend sat forward, hanging on my every word, entranced by this new development. Outside, I imagined I could hear the whistling coming from just outside the clearing. They didn't talk anymore. They didn't laugh. They didn't joke. They let their feet take them ever onward, but the whistling followed them. The friends who had insisted it was nothing said that maybe they should speed up a little bit. The campsite couldn't be far. Once they were there, they could take a side trail and get back to town. Or whatever it was might leave and they could get back to their campout. The other two agreed, but all of them knew that the campout was already canceled. None of them would sleep here tonight, not willingly. They sped up, but the whistling followed them steadily. One of them said that they should stop and confront the whistler. He must be human. Who else could whistle? The other two shot him down, though. The whistling was discordant, jangling against their nerves, sounding like nothing they had ever heard before. Both agreed that they didn't want to find out what whistled like that, and they kept moving. Something bumped the bottom of the tree, but my audience didn't seem to notice. It wasn't a hard bump. It didn't shiver the whole tree. It felt more like an inquisitive tap, a gentle knock, someone trying to get our attention. I put it out of my mind, maybe the wind or something, and kept telling my story. They kept moving, deeper and deeper into the woods, all the time being chased by the whistling. They broke into a run, the campsite still not coming into view, and still the whistling grew closer and louder. The whistling took on a life of its own, rising and falling in its chaotic tune as it became less and less discernible. The children put their hands over their ears, the noise scraping against their mind like a rusty scalpel. The hands would not block out the whistling, though. They heard it inside their heads as it battered their senses, and when the first one tripped, the other two did not stop to help him. They didn't hear his screams, but they felt a change when the whistling thing got him. A night bird called out from the forest, but now the whistling was in my own head, and I only registered it as something different. I told the story frantically, hoping it would stop the whistling in my head somehow. They dropped their packs and ran. They sprinted, flat out, knowing that the trail must be up ahead. They would round the bend, and there it would be. It would be there, as it always had been, and they would cut back towards town. It never occurred to them that the creature could just cut through the forest after them. The trail to town had a talismanic effect on them. If they could make it, then they could walk it, and then they would be safe. They ran, they wept, but the whistling followed them on and on, their feet crunching against the leaves and pine needles, sounding like gunfire, but they hardly noticed over the eerie whistling in their heads. My two friends were leaning close now, the lantern making their faces look like jack-o'-lanterns as their eyes begged for the climax. And still, that whistling assaulted me, threatening to drive me mad. If they noticed it, they gave no indication. When the second boy fell, the first never noticed. He ran and ran, trying to outdistance the whistling, trying to get it out of his head, and when his friend was found, the whistling again took on a different note. The lone boy ran and ran, hoping to outdistance the crazed whistling, knowing that his fate would be the same as his friend's if it caught him. Some say he runs to this very day. Some say the whistling got him in the end. No one knows for sure. I heard the whistling abate a little. It didn't leave, but it did lighten slightly. I felt like crying as I came to the end of my story. Maybe I would be allowed to live where the boys had died. The search parties found their backpacks 2 days later, animals having worried at them to get at the food that was inside. They found the campsite bare, no fire having been lit in weeks. Of the boys, they found no sign. No trace was ever found. Not a scrap of clothes, not a footprint. They were never seen again, but the children in the area say that you can hear the whistling in the woods on quiet nights. On those nights, it's best to stay indoors. The whistling takes all who venture too close, and the whistling will haunt you for the rest of your life, however long that may be. That was when the whistling stopped. It stopped so abruptly that I wondered if it had ever been there at all. For a 10-year-old to question his mental stability was a strange feeling, but at that moment, I was just glad it had passed me by. The other two shook off their rapture, looking as though they had been hypnotized, and Terry blew out a long breath. Well, damn, that was a good story. I can't top that, and suddenly I'm feeling kind of tired. Yeah, Reggie said dreamily. Me too. Think maybe we should go to bed. I would have argued with them on most nights, but tonight I was as drained as the rest. We laid out our sleeping bags and burrowed down, dropping off quickly without the usual chatter that preceded it. I'd like to tell you that that's where the story ends. I wish I could, but that wouldn't be doing justice to the memory of my friends. I awoke in the wee hours of the morning when someone threw a pillow at me. It was not thrown playfully. The throw was hard, angry, and directed at my face. I sat up, rubbing my cheek, and became aware of the keening whistle that had returned. It was louder than ever, and it chilled me to the bone. For God's sake, stop it, Terry yelled, staring daggers at me. Your story was good. We all said so, but trying to scare us with that stupid whistling isn't funny. I heard someone crying and looked over to see Reggie in the corner with his hands against his face. The whistling was loud and discordant, just as I had described it in my story, and it appeared that I wasn't the only one that could hear it now. Terry looked madder than I had ever seen him, and Reggie was clearly terrified after the story I had spun. It's not me, I swear, I told them. Terry glanced at me for a few seconds before realizing that I was right. He had woken me up. How could I be the whistler? He moved to the window and I joined him, trying to see the source of the whistling. Most nights we would have nothing to see but the inky blackness, but under the light of the full moon, the yard was shadowy but visible. As we scanned the yard, we could see little. The fire pit below, the logs we sat at as we toasted our marshmallows and wieners, the woodpile we had tarped against the rain. I had almost decided to go check the other window when Terry gasped like a stepped-on cat. I looked and saw a man in a long cloak step out of the tree line. He was dressed in a dark gray coat, long and flowing like a trench coat, and a tall cowboy hat, making him look almost 7 feet tall as it poked towards the sky. The toes of his pointy boots poked from beneath the coat, and I thought they looked battered and scuffed even from here. The wind seemed loath to touch him, but by the way he pulled the cloak around him, you'd have thought he was freezing. I could see a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight as they looked up at us, and decided that he must be wearing glasses. Of him, we could see very little under the cloak, but he made us uneasy. The whistling seemed to be coming from beneath the cloak, and when it stopped, he began to speak, and I wished for the whistling again. His voice was raspy, pinched, croaksome, a dead man's pleading last words. "It's so cold, boys. Might I take shelter in your treehouse for the night?" I shuddered, not knowing what to say. Somehow, though, Terry found his voice. "Go away. Our mother told us not to talk to strangers, and we don't know you." "Please, boys, kind boys. Didn't your mother teach you hospitality? Let an old man in out of the cold," he pleaded. "No," Terry said, and moved away from the window as though the man might somehow leap through it. The man didn't yell. He didn't plead. He just sat on the log beneath our tree and continued to whistle. The jagged cords wafted up into the treehouse, and I saw Terry shudder. He picked up a boot that had been part of my costume and went to the window to throw it at the man. Terry sent it sailing, but hissed when it didn't connect. He threw several other things at the whistler, but the old man never seemed to be where he was aiming. Terry cussed loudly, reaching for the lamp. I wrapped my arm around it, begging him not to. "It's all the light we have, Terry. Please." He tore it out of my hand, growling as it came free. He chucked it at the old man, the heavy plastic thing not even getting close to the target. It broke on the ground, shattering and fizzling with an electric pop. The inside of the treehouse was darker for its passing, the three of us now sitting in near darkness. The whistling went on, though. The man never seemed to run out of breath, and the shrill noise took its toll on all of us. Reggie began to rock in the corner, sobbing loudly as the man whistled and whistled below. Terry screamed at him from the window, his rage never ending, as I covered my ears and tried to keep the threads of my sanity together. It seemed to last for hours, for days, and as I sat with my eyes closed, I prayed it would end. When I heard the floorboards creak, I opened my eyes. It was Reggie standing by the window, his foot already on the ledge. "Reggie? What are you doing?" I breathed, half getting up. Reggie looked back at me, snot runners creeping down his face. His naked face looked tortured, tears cutting lines down his dirty cheeks, still streaked with green. He smiled gruesomely at me as he framed himself in the window, and I didn't have to ask what he intended to do. I tried to stop him. I pulled myself up from the floor to go to him, but it was already too late. I just wanted to stop," he breathed, before throwing himself out the window. We never heard him hit the ground over the loud and terrible whistling. Terry stormed over to the hatch and had it unlatched before I could throw myself across it. "What are you doing?" "What do you think I'm doing? I'm gonna go do something about this guy." "He's an adult, Terry. You can't do anything to him." "Get out of my way. I'm going out there." "He's scary, Terry. You shouldn't go out there. You'll end up like Reggie. Terry kicked me, sending waves of pain through my guts, and I rolled off the trap door. I heard him throw it open and toss the ladder down, descending in a shriek of rage as he made his way towards the whistler. As scared as it had made Reggie, the whistler had made Terry a furious juggernaut. I drew myself up, my ribs hurting as I hobbled to the trap door. I looked down before closing it, and gasped in horror against my throbbing chest. The man was at the bottom of the ladder. His face was still hidden by the coat, his eyes a glistening twosome amidst the swirling dark void, and I could see thick red fluid around the collar of that cloak. He was 2 rungs up the ladder, temporarily frozen by my gaze, and I slammed the hatch and threw the lock a second before he slammed into it. I crawled away from the hatch, seeing it buck wildly and hearing him scream at me to open it. He cussed and howled like an angry animal, wanting to get in, but stopped by the strong bolt that some past child had installed on the sturdy hatch. Maybe they had installed it to keep him out, I thought. My fear overtopped me at some point as I watched the door jump in its frame, and I must have passed out. When the banging woke me up, it was daylight, and I screamed loud enough to startle whoever was banging. Easy, kid. It's Sheriff Blasky. Are you okay? I dragged myself to the hatch, my ribs aching, and threw the bolt before falling back, panting. If it was the Whistler, I hoped he was quick at least. My ribs would turn out to be broken, and their healing would encompass 2 of the worst months of my life. Every time I breathed in, I was reminded of the Whistler and that last encounter with Terry. At that moment, though, I didn't care what happened. I just wanted it to end. Sheriff Blasky pushed the flap open, though, and I guessed I'd get to live another day. He took me to the hospital. He took me into the waiting arms of my parents, who pulled me into their warm embrace and threatened to never let me go. I'd been missing for 2 days, they told me, and when the police had seen the state of our treehouse, they feared the worst. They never found any sign of Terry or Reggie. I told them what had happened. I told them about the whistling man, about Reggie's fall, and Terry charging him from the treehouse. I told them about how I'd locked the trap door and passed out as I watched the man trying to batter his way in. They took my statement, searched those woods with officers and dogs and every able-bodied set of legs they could find in town, but they never found anything. Not a scrap of cloth, not a drop of blood. My friends were just gone. That was 8 years ago. I've seen that night in my dreams every night since. The events live on in my memories, and I often wake up screaming as the man tries to break that hatch open. In my dreams, I don't pass out. In my dreams, the hatch doesn't hold. In my dreams, I wake up as he wraps his hands around my throat and drags me towards that pitch-black maw he hides behind his coat. I haven't been back in the forest since that day. I don't think I ever will. Lately, though, I've been hearing the whistling as I lay in bed at night. I look out the window, my backyard butting up to the woods, and see 2 small figures hovering on the outskirts. Sometimes the man in the coat is there too, but I know better than to try to tell my parents. They're gone when they get there, and I just end up looking crazy. I leave for college next week, and I've chosen one in the middle of a big city. I plan to attend it because the closest collection of more than 4 trees is 60 miles from my dorm. I'm hoping that distance will stop this apparition, but I just don't know. I can hear the whistling now, even as I write this. I can hear my dead friend's soft call as they entice me to come out to play. I can hear that whistling as it scrapes across my nerves yet again. I hear it, and I hope that I get to leave for college before it becomes too much for me to bear, before it calls me back to the treehouse once again.
Always reminds me of how my grandpa used to tell me not to whistle in the woods, especially at night. You never know what's going to pick up that tune. Moving right along, we go into Halloween rituals, like the ritual of picking up our candy and having a good time. But what happens when that good time lasts a little too long? Let's hear about the longest Halloween.
Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie? Matthew was standing on the front porch, looking up at his mother through the eye holes of his homemade ghost costume. Mom, I don't feel good. Maybe I won't go out tonight. His mom looked down at him, smiling in that strange way he had become so accustomed to. It was definitely supposed to be his mom, her red hair falling softly around her shoulders as she wore the thrift store bridal gown that she had ripped up for her zombie bride costume. But Matthew knew that it wasn't her. When she turned her head, he could hear the tendons creaking in her neck, and her rictus of a smile made the corners of her mouth turn up painfully. "Come on, honey. Halloween comes but once a year." Matthew sighed. If only that were the case. They stepped off the front porch, making their way into the throng of children that happily capered about the cul-de-sac. His ghost costume looked a little plain when compared to the others, but Matthew couldn't find it in himself to be self-conscious anymore. They weren't kids, at any rate. Not the kids he'd grown up with. Behind their colorful masks or painted faces, their oddly yellow eyelids were black, with soulless eyes. "I can't, Matthew said, letting his hand slip from his mother's. Can't what, sweetie? She asked, turning her painful smile on him. I can't do this anymore, he yelled, throwing his bucket down and rounding on her. The throng of trick-or-treaters turned to stare at him, and Matthew suddenly realized his mistake. Not for the first time, and not for the last. Sweetie, his mother said, turning slowly, her arms and legs like something full of coat hangers and newspaper. It's Halloween. You either treat, or you get tricked. The kids began to circle around him, their voices low, their eyes shining like pools of tar. Trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat. Matthew could hear his heart beating in his ears. He could almost hear it as he backed away. It was noisy, soupy, and constantly pounding, fundamentally different from a normal heartbeat in every way. He bumped into a teenage Michael Myers, and the big mute pushed him over before he could properly get his bearings. He fell down hard on his chest, and then they were on him. Luckily, as Matt lay face down on the concrete, he didn't have to watch this time. They ripped his back apart, their sharp little teeth digging into his flesh. He felt the warm blood oozing down his back, the asphalt drinking it up as the kids tore him apart. His arms separated with a sickening pop, his sheet tearing as it was ripped, and Matthew lost consciousness. He hoped that maybe this would be the last time, and that it all would end. He was so tired of being a ghost, tired of Halloween, and as the bright lights made him squint, he felt hot tears joining his blood on the pavement. Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie? Matthew looked up at his mother, nodding as he reached up and took her hand for the 1,000th time. It didn't feel like a real hand. Not anymore. It felt mushy in the wrong places, hard and unmoving in others, like a palsied claw after a loved one's had a stroke. She looked down at him, smiling like a corpse, and Matthew tried to ignore the fact that the skin around her ears was darker than it had been the last time. His mother appeared to be rotting before his eyes, but to make note of it would bring on something worse. He walked once more into the sea of children, watching them run and cheer, but feeling their eyes as they tracked him. The whole street was like living in a forest of lions. Any minute, they might spring from concealment and tear you to pieces. He had been here long enough to know, however, that as long as you played along with this everlasting Halloween, it was content to keep you in its clutches. As they came to the first house, Matthew could see old Mr. Debro as he smiled and stepped through the door. The liver spots on his head were starting to look more like mold, but Matthew tried to ignore it as he shook his bag half-heartedly. The old man would drop 2 small Kit Kats in there and tell him to have a great evening, just like he did every time. And Matthew just wanted to get on with the charade. When the candy didn't fall into the bag like it always did, Matt looked up and saw the grinning face of the old man as it loomed over him. "Forgot your manners, son?" Matthew gasped. He'd become so complacent. He'd been here long enough to know that you didn't get candy unless you said the magic words, but he was so tired. He'd been trick-or-treating for ages. He was exhausted. Every time he finished, every time he came to the end, good or bad, it would all just begin again. He was starting to feel like if he looked at his own reflection, he might be the one that was beginning to rot. He tried to stammer out a hurried trick-or-treat, but he could already see the long, sharp legs as they protruded from the corners of the man's mouth. Whatever horrors that lay inside these things, already dragging itself free. The words came from what sounded like a drowned man's throat, or the dying voice of someone who's slowly choking to death. And Matthew heard it just as the pinchers on the horrific whatever it were shot out from between Mr. Debro's stained false teeth and latched onto his head. The teeth clicked together as they hit the ground like a set of sad castanets, but Matthew heard his words as he faded once more into black. "You'll have to remember next time." Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie? Matt didn't even look up at her this time. He lifted his hand and grabbed a hold of her withered paw as he let her lead him into the cul-de-sac. He moved on autopilot, remembering only the words that must be said as they came to each house. The candy filled the bag, the grown-ups continuing to smile their hollow grins, and all the while, Matthew trudged onward. He saw the corner coming up, the junction of Marla and Casterly, and Matt saw someone that made him go cold inside. The man was dressed as Indiana Jones, bullwhip hanging jauntily off his waist, and when he turned to wave at someone who had called his name, Matthew steered his mother towards a different house, back the way they had come. "Come on, Mom, we missed the Jafford house. Miss Jafford wants to see your costume, remember?" His mother looked unsure, but she turned away, smiling as she allowed herself to be led. "All right, Matty, don't tug." Matt looked back as he left, seeing the man and knowing that he didn't want his mother to talk to him. She had talked to him once before, hadn't she? She had talked to him, and something bad had happened, but it didn't seem like something that had happened here. He didn't know, he couldn't really say, but when he saw the guy, the ear-shattering heartbeat had come on again, and he suddenly knew that letting her talk to him would be the scariest thing he had ever experienced. As the night went on, Matthew held out hope that the lights might start going off, and that he might be allowed to sleep. The bag was heavy, the pillowcase bulging oddly as it threatened to split, but still, he and his mother walked the streets of the cul-de-sac. How many times had he done this, Matt wondered? 100? 200? 1,000? It felt like an eternity as his sore feet slapped the pavement, and his trainers threatened to fall to pieces. "Do you remember the first time, Mom?" he asked suddenly, his eyes heavy as he repositioned the bag to rub at them. "Your first Halloween?" she asked, looking down at him with that fishhook grin. "I sure do. You were so cute in your cow costume. You said ooh instead of moo, and the neighbors laughed and said you were adorable." "No," Matt said. "I mean the first time we did this." "Look over there," she said suddenly. "The Holsteins are waving. Let's go see what they have." Matt nodded, following behind her as she led him like a cow to the slaughter. Matthew remembered the first time. He remembered it well. He'd looked up into his mother's eyes and been so excited. He had run down the street, tugging her along as they went house to house to house. That had been the first time he'd seen the man on the corner, the first time he had steered her away from him, not understanding why. He had laughed when the pillowcase had ripped open, spilling his candy in the road, and when his mother had pulled another one out of nowhere, he had started filling that one too. The moon had been full, a big old round Halloween moon, and Matthew reveled in the light of the buttery orb. It had taken him a while to get tired, but he had finally asked Mom if they could go home so he could rest. She had tried to dissuade him, telling him they only had a few more houses, a little while longer. When he asked again, she had tried to push him on, but he had stopped. "I'm tired, Mama. I'm ready to go home." She had turned then, and that was the first time he had noticed the smile. Her smile, that sharp and painful grin that seemed sad as she looked at him, and he had known that there was something off. This wasn't what he had wanted. This hadn't been what he'd wanted. He had just wanted a Halloween that would... Matt swallowed, true fear creeping up in him as he looked at her unnatural smile and noticed that the children had stopped moving around them. He had just wanted a Halloween that would last forever. "Oh, sweetie," his mother had said, "you either get treats or you get tricks." That was when he had seen them for what they truly were. They had circled around him, chanting, "Trick or treat," and as they swarmed in, they had torn him to pieces with their bare hands. All the joy had melted off his face as their nails and teeth dug into him, and when he had woken up on the front porch, his mother asking if he was ready, he had known that something was amiss. "Matty?" Matthew looked up, seeing that Mrs. Holstein had asked him a question. "Sorry, ma'am, what were you saying?" "I asked if you were a scary ghost or not." She was smiling, but it was like Matt could see the bugs crawling under her skin. It made him think that each of them had some kind of centipede or spider beneath their skin, just waiting to leap out. All of them seemed to have something in them, just below the surface, and Matthew was no longer certain he wanted to know what it was. It was hungry, whatever it was, and it seemed to enjoy making him suffer for his slip-ups. "Yes, ma'am. He yawned, feeling wobbly as the candy sack tried to anchor him to the earth. It's scary, go. He fell then, not for the first time either. He hit the ground, his mother asking him to get back up, but he was just so tired. Matthew closed his eyes, hoping he would pass out, but it never happened. He could feel the adults looming around him, hear the chants of trick or treat, and when something slammed against his chest, he felt the breath whoosh out of him as it pierced his heart. He hoped it would be over this time, hoped he'd be allowed to die or wake up or whatever this was, but as he heard his mother's voice, he knew it wouldn't happen. Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie? His tired eyes came open, but as he reached for her hand, a new thought occurred. I forgot something inside. I'll be right back. He took a step for the door, but her hand clutched at him, just as it had the last time he'd tried this. It'll be okay. We can get it later. Come on, let's... But then he shoved her, and that seemed to take her by surprise. He ran inside, shutting the door as she got back to her feet. As he turned the deadbolt, she started pounding dully on the hardwood. Now, Maddie, you know how this works. You either get the treat, or you get the tricks. He could already hear the muffled cries of trick or treat coming from behind the door, and he backed away slowly as he watched it. He wasn't strong enough to push the couch in front of the door, or even one of the recliners, but he did shove the end table in the hallway over, as he went running up the stairs to close the door to his room behind him. He locked the door and squeezed himself into the corner as he threw the sheet he was still wearing across the room. He could hear loud thumping coming from downstairs, and he didn't think that door would keep them out for long. He racked his brain, trying to figure out how to get out of this. He thought back across all those trick-or-treating trips, all the nights that had come before this, and his mind always went back to the man in the wide-brimmed hat. He was scared of him in a way that he wasn't of any of the others. Not the bugs or the feral kids or anything he'd seen scared him as much as that man. Why, though? Why did he terrify him so much? Why did he fill him with dread like this? I want you to meet someone. He covered his ears, but the voice wasn't coming from the house. He's kind of important to me, just like you. He put his head between his knees and started crying as the door broke loudly from downstairs, and the words of the children came wafting up to him. I've been seeing him sometimes, after work or while you're at Grandma's for the weekend, and I think he might be... But the rest of it droned down to a low growl as his brain hit the brakes on it. He tried desperately to remember what his mother had said, but he couldn't. His mind struggled with the memory, but as he tried to make it make sense, he heard them pounding on the bedroom door. They were pushing, threatening to break the door, and he curled into a ball as he tried to make the memories come back. Trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat! They came thundering into the room, and as they fell on him, one thought broke the surface above all the others. He needed to face his fears and go see that man. One clear word stuck out in his brain, though, as he was pummeled into oblivion. No. Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie? The words still sounded in his brain, even after the last few times. Matthew had gone along with her for the last however many times, to varying degrees of success. He always avoided the man, always turned her back into the endless cul-de-sac of candy-laden houses, but it always ended the same. He forgot his manners, he went off script and tried to escape. He simply fell over out of exhaustion, and then they had him. He reached for her hand again, and as they walked, his brain tried to argue itself into sense, just like it had the last however many times. They needed to talk to the man at the end of the block. No. Trick or treat, Matt droned, Mr. Deborah smiling as the legs sat just inside his cheeks, a silent warning to be careful. He knows something. Maybe it's how we get out of this. No. Come on, Mom. Let's go to the Andersons, Matt said, stalling for time. They're not going anywhere, honey, she said as he pulled her along, her lips looking chapped as she smiled and smiled. He has to know something. We need to... No. Are you a scary ghost? Miss Holstein asked, and Matt nodded as he told her he was, indeed, a scary ghost. But if we just... No. Matt finally yelled, clutching his head as he fell to his knees in the road. He wanted his brain to shut up. He was tired. He was so tired. He wanted to go to bed. He just wanted this all to end. He just... That's when he noticed that they were looking at him. Matt closed his eyes, and oblivion came on not too much later. Well, not oblivion. Something more like purgatory. Ready to? But he shoved her again and went running down the street, ghost costume flapping as he jumped off the porch. The kids were after him in a second, but Matt didn't care. They would get him, one way or another, but he just needed a break from the constant tricking and treating. He was running up the street, the crowd behind him, and when he looked up, the children seemed to bulge with the scrabbling things as well. They were full of bugs, full of hate, and Matthew needed a way to get beyond this. He turned back just in time to bump into someone, and as he fell down, he covered his head, expecting to be killed by the howling mob. When it didn't come, Matt looked up to see who he had run into. Need a hand up, little buddy? It was the man in the Indiana Jones costume, and to Matt, he looked like the closest thing to an angel he'd ever seen. Matt took his hand, shaking a little as he looked behind him. The mob had stopped, watching the man in confusion, and as Matthew looked up through the eyes of his ghost costume, he became aware that this fellow looked different. He looked real, untouched by this place, and Matt wondered why he'd been afraid of him. "It's great to finally meet you, Matt. Your mother's told me all about you, and I've been looking forward to meeting you. I'm Derek. I guess I'm your mom's..." But the words seemed to slow down, and the dread came back into Matthew. As the mob came back to screaming life, Matt realized why he had been afraid of this guy. Matthew turned, wanting to run away, but he was blinded by bright lights and put his hands up to stop them. As he fell into oblivion, Matthew came to terms with what he had to do, and he hoped that he still had the strength. He needed to face his fears, otherwise he'd be stuck here forever. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" He looked up into his mother's smiling face, the corners of her mouth red as they threatened to crack, and shook his head. "Not yet, Mom. We're missing someone." He reached up and took her hand, and as they walked off towards the thing he feared most, the kids parted for them. They watched him, chanting their infernal mantra, and it seemed that he had the eyes of the entire neighborhood. As he walked towards the swollen moon, he felt it swivel in the sky, and the craters too seemed to watch him as he made a beeline for the spot he had tried to avoid. It wasn't easy. Each step felt like the first step towards a high dive at the pool, or the roller coaster at the amusement park. He could see the man, his hat at a jaunty angle, and as they moved closer to him, all the people around them held their breath. "Julia," Derek said, raising his hand and walking over. "And this must be Matthew. Good to meet you, buddy. I'm Derek." He put out a hand, and Matt shook it heartily. "Matty, I want you to meet someone," his mother said. "He's kind of important, like you, and I've been seeing him sometimes, after work or while you're at Grandma's for the weekend. I think he might be someone you'll be seeing a lot more of in the future. Matthew, this is Derek. He's my boyfriend." Matt told him it was a pleasure to meet him, and he watched the two of them talking quietly, expecting that now things would go back to the way they were. This was it. This was one of those storybook moments that would turn everything back the way it was supposed to be. Matthew smiled as he watched her slip his hand into his, and it felt like everything would be okay now. When the first person began to scream, he felt a little less sure than he had been before. The mob of children had followed them, the adults standing out like sore thumbs amongst them, and many of them were pointing at him. The huge moon that he had thought of as an eye only moments before cracked like an egg as it burst into two pieces. It began to rain something down on them, something that didn't look entirely pleasant. They slapped against his ghost costume wetly, but as one fell across the eye hole, Matt saw that they were bugs. They looked like a cross between a centipede and a spider, and as he threw it away, the crowd began to surge towards him. Matt ran, the only thing he could do, and as his mother and Derek stood amongst the throng of chasers, they looked like rocks in a rushing river. He ran, his sore feet almost spilling him into the road more than once. He'd been so sure that this would work, that this would free him, but now he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. The creepy crawlies were biting him as they covered the outside of his costume, weighing him down and making him sore. As the mob closed in, their cries of "trick or treat" sounded like a war chant, and Matt saw bright lights coming up fast. He put a hand up, shielding his eyes, but he didn't dare stop running. As the lights bore down on him, he hoped he would wake up anywhere besides the front porch of his house. Heaven, hell, nothingness, whatever was coming next, Matthew welcomed it with open arms. The cries of the mob were driven into blissful silence, only to be replaced by a harsh and rhythmic beeping. Matt opened his eyes as his hand shot up to slap at his ear, making his head ring. He could see a pristine hospital room with a beeping IV pole attached to one arm, and the warm sun of mid-morning outside the big window. His mother was snoring softly as she lay across his feet, and as he moved his prickly legs to make them wake up, she stirred and looked at him in surprise. "Oh my God, Matthew!" She wrapped him in a hug, his IV making him feel pinched, but he was happy to have woken up somewhere different for a change. "Hey, Mom, what's going on?" She smoothed his hair, her eyes wet-looking as she tried to commit him to memory. You got hit by a car, sweetie. You ran away while we were trick-or-treating after..." She opened her mouth like a fish, but shook it off. It's not important. What's important is that you're awake." "Where's Derek?" The vision of the two of them standing stationary as the group of screaming children poured past them, still very vivid in his mind. He's been by a few times. He wanted to make sure you were okay. I told him I might need to take a break, though. I didn't mean to upset you when I told you. I knew it was sudden, but I shouldn't have said it so quickly. I should have eased you into it. I'm sorry, Maddie," she said, half crying. It's okay. I was just surprised. I shouldn't have run away. You should call him and let him know that everything's okay." His mother looked shocked, but happy. She'd clearly been worried for a while, but she was happy that Matthew was awake again. She stood up, asking if he wanted something to drink, and Matt nodded in the affirmative. His throat was very dry, and it felt like a while since he had used it properly. It wasn't until the sun set that night that Matthew became anxious again. His mother excused herself, saying she needed to get some food and maybe call Derek and tell him that Matthew was okay. She had sat with him all day, watching cartoons and just kind of holding him, but it appeared that her lack of lunch was catching up with her. The hospital was quieter now, the night shift still in full swing, but she still stopped before heading out the door. "You'll be okay for a few minutes, right? You look a little pale, like there's something on your mind." Matt assured her that he'd be fine, but he was still a little happier once she was out the door. As another yawn shot through him, Matthew thought about how his body would make him sleep soon, and he thought of something he should have considered earlier today. He hadn't noticed right away, but when he had brought his hand down from his ear, he had wiped something onto the sheet. He must have rolled it up in the sheet somehow, because he hadn't thought about it until he had put his hand onto the spot a while later. His mother had been in the bathroom, the door open so she could peek out at him to make sure he hadn't just disappeared, and when he unbound the sheet, he saw something far too familiar there, staining the sheet brown and red as it pressed against him. It was part of the things that had been falling out of the moon, the head and pincers of that strange centipede spider thing. He had picked it up in a napkin and thrown it in the garbage before his mother could see it. But what did it mean? Did it mean all that had been real? Had the creature come from inside his head? Matt didn't know what to think, but he found himself wondering something as he lay there, feeling tired. When he went to sleep, would he wake up in the real world, or would he fall back into that eternal Halloween? Matt was afraid that he might find out soon enough.
Just goes to show you, you can certainly have too much of a good thing. This next one is a certified holiday classic. So, let's have a look at an old friend that you may remember from a very recent story this year. If, I suppose, you could call spring recent. Let's hear the origins of everyone's favorite cornfield boogin, the Corn Man.
I remember it like it was yesterday. My mom was at work, and my brother Daryl was watching me. Daryl was older than me, about 6 years, and he was kind of a jerk. Our dad had left right after I was born, and Mom had to work 2 jobs to keep us fed and clothed and keep the lights on and the roof over our heads. Maybe Daryl blamed me for Dad leaving, and that's why he was usually so mean to me. He was never violent, though I got the feeling he wanted to be sometimes, but he always teased me. He told me there were monsters in the basement who would eat me, and told me there were ghosts in the attic, that the boogeyman would come and carry me off some night, about all the perverts who would just scoop me up off the street someday and do stuff I didn't really understand at the time. He liked to scare me, and I think that's how we got on the subject of the Corn Man. It happened one afternoon when we were playing hide and seek. Daryl rarely played with me, not unless Mom made him, and he was being slow about counting, just trying to wait for Mom to go to work so we could go back inside and keep watching TV like he wanted to. He was counting, and I was hiding out in the cornfield where I knew he wouldn't find me. As he finished, he stepped out into the field, knowing that's where I was. He started looking, cursing, and stomping around as he couldn't find me, and seemed to be getting pretty frustrated. Finally, he said the words I will never forget. "Better come out, turd, before the Corn Man gets ya." I stood up. He had been pretty close to finding me, and asking who the Corn Man was. Daryl smiled wickedly, seeing another opportunity to scare me and get himself back inside as well. The Corn Man, he told me, lived in the cornfields that seemed to perpetually surround our house. The field was filled with corn during this time of year, and Daryl said that the Corn Man patrolled it and got little kids who went out to play in the field. He said that the Corn Man couldn't see you if you stayed still. If you just stood like a statue, not moving an inch, he wouldn't see you, and he'd think you were just another stalk of corn. I told him not to lie, but he said it was true, and said we should get back inside before the Corn Man caught us in the field. We were both in the living room, Daryl gripping the remote and flipping through the channels, as Mom said goodbye and left for the night. He had spent that week tormenting me with stories about the Corn Man that were usually just ways for him to get out of stuff. "Corn Man will come into your house if he smells garbage. Better take it out before he smells it." I heard Corn Man comes to take away messy kids. "You better clean up around here." "Oh, you're gonna tell Mom, huh? Well, the Corn Man loves to eat little tattletales, so go ahead and tell Mom you saw me smoking. I hope I'm awake when he comes to get you." That night, however, he just grinned as someone knocked on the door. He told me to go get it, and I prickled a little. I didn't want to go out after dark. Not after what he had told me about the Corn Man mainly hunting at night, and usually for kids who were out past curfew. He pushed me with his boot as I dithered, and I stumbled to the door as someone pounded on it again. My hands shook as I reached out, turning the knob slowly as I pulled it open. I sighed happily, though, happy to see Reggie and Clyde for the first time in my life. Reggie and Clyde had been Daryl's friends since elementary school. Mark was usually with them as well, but I supposed he must be off doing something else. They were often involved in Daryl's shenanigans, and I kinda hated seeing them come around. Tonight, though, I was just glad they weren't the Corn Man. I turned to tell Daryl that his friends were here, but he was already heading for the door, pulling on his leather jacket. He told me he was going out, and I asked where he was going after dark. "Not that it's any of your business, but we're gonna go summon the Corn Man so he'll give us a wish." I felt my mouth slip open and asked why he would do that. "Well, in the story, if you can complete his challenge, then he grants you a wish. But," he said, turning back towards the door, "you'd better stay here. You'd probably be too scared to come out into the cornfield after dark." I agreed with him, until I realized that meant I'd be home alone, all night, by myself. I had grabbed my coat and ran after the 3 of them before I could think better of it. The 3 of them were standing by the cornfield, cigarettes winking on and off as I approached. Clyde elbowed Daryl and pointed at me. Daryl grinned the widest I'd ever seen him grin, and the effect was pretty terrifying. He looked like a ghoul from a zombie movie in the cigarette light. Maybe even one of those pedophiles he was always telling me would get me. Well, 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 look who decided to join us. You trying to get a wish too, turd? No, I said, snuffling a little in a mixture of fear and mucus. I just didn't want to be at home alone. What are you talking about? You never said you got wishes from the corn man. Daryl took a long drag off his smoke, the light making his face look like a jack-o'-lantern. Well, the word is that if you stand in the field and say the magic words, the corn man will come and test you. If you can stand as still as a cornstalk, not moving and not being caught, he'll grant you one wish. But if he catches you, your blood will water his cornfield. So, sound like something you want to do, turd? I shook my head nervously, the wind rustling the corn and making me shudder. I didn't want to go out there, but I didn't want to stay here in the dark alone either. He snorted at me and rolled his eyes, pitching his cigarette away from the dry cornfield. Well then, go home if you're going to be a baby. The rest of us will get our wishes, and you'll just be home, pissing your pants. I shook my head again, and he must have taken it for acquiescence. Then come on, or don't. I don't really care. They set off into the thick cornfield, and I followed after them. The sea of stalks whipped past me as the three bigger boys walked in front of me. It was dark, the night birds and the sound of animals tuning up all around us. I was shivering, and it had nothing to do with the night or the chill in the air. I was scared, terrified even, and the jostling boys laughed and whispered to each other as they walked towards the center of the vast cornfield. When the corn surrounded us, we stopped, and Daryl turned to look at us. Okay, so now we chant the special chant to summon him. They stood in a triangle, looking at me, and I moved up to make it a diamond. Corn man, come to me if you can. Corn man, I can stand as the corn stalks can. Corn man, still as stone, not like a man. Corn man, still and quiet as the corn stalks can. He looked at us as he finished and told us to chant with him. As we raised our voices to the sky, I began to slur my words as my teeth chattered. I was terrified, standing in the cornfield that had been the setting of so many nightmares, and listening as we summoned the creature that had stalked me through those hated fields. Why had I come with them? Would I really have been less safe at home? Wouldn't I have been fine as long as I stayed inside? I heard my brother's words as he told me about how the corn man came after kids who were alone. They drifted through my mind as I felt myself start to cry. I chanted the words to summon the corn man along with the rest of them, tears streaming down my face as the fear took hold. When we heard the rustling, Daryl told us to be quiet. All right, stand still so he can't see you. If you move, he'll catch you, and then you'll be dead. All four of us stood as still as we could, the corn rustling as something came towards our location. I hoped that maybe it was the farmer that owned the land. He was a nice guy, but he didn't like people playing in his cornfield after dark. If not him, then I hoped it was some of the teenagers he usually kicked out of the field. Let it be anyone but the shadowy monster that was the corn man. He was like a scarecrow with corn stalks for hands and a mouthful of black teeth in my dreams. He would grow very high on his cornstalk legs, and he was faster than anything ever, even Jason or Michael Myers. As we stood in the field like idiots, I saw the sack head of a scarecrow come through the stalks and had to stifle a scream. He was wearing overalls and a straw hat, his face a sack with grease paint, and he was lumbering up out of the corn shakily. He had normal hands, but one of them was holding a scythe and the other was holding a hatchet. As he came stomping out of the corn, I held as still as possible, not moving a single muscle. He was real. He was actually real. In my mind, I had believed in him, of course I had, but I had hoped that he wasn't really real. It's hard to explain, but some rational part of my mind knew that it was all just a goof my brother had come up with to scare me. Now I was forced to cower as we watched this terror hunt through the field for us. He moved like a wraith, silent and sure, except for the crunch of old corn husks. He smacked at the stalks with his scythe sometimes, and I had to stop my teeth from chattering as he turned to finally look at my hiding place. Until then, he had lumbered around like one of those adults that's only pretending to look for you. I felt like he knew where we were. He was choosing not to find us, and now the game was up. I moved my eyes around, not daring to turn my head, but I couldn't see my brother or his friends anywhere. Had they made a break for it? This was their idea after all. Why would they run? Had the corn man gotten them? No, I would have heard that. They had abandoned me. Daryl had finally gotten tired of having me around and decided to have the corn man do his dirty work for him. Mom and the police would search for me, but they'd never find my body. I would water the corn forever. As my eyes rolled around looking for them, the sack head turned towards me, and the creature started stalking in my direction. I was speechless, utterly terrified, and as I stood like a statue, I felt a warm stream of urine run down my leg. As the cloth hood came within inches of my face, I could hear his raspy breath beneath it, smell the air as he stared down, and I found myself wishing he would just get it over with already. We stared at each other for a count of 20 before the corn man blew out a raspberry of barely contained laughter and let his weapons drop to the ground. Are you kidding me? Daryl, your brother pissed his pants! All three of them came out of the tall cornfield then, laughing like donkeys. The mask came off to reveal Mark's stupid, sweaty face as he guffawed at me. They surrounded me like a pack of jackals, and all pointed to the piss stain on my pants and the liquid running down into the dirt. I felt the tears falling again, but my body was still locked in a rictus of terror. Daryl had tricked me. He tricked me again. He had terrified me and humiliated me, and now I would have to walk back home with cold, wet pants as my brother and his friends laughed at me. I wanted to run away, but my legs weren't quite ready to spirit me away just yet. That's probably the only reason I'm still alive. I saw Mark jerk suddenly, the smile dribbling off his face as something squelched from his stomach. It spattered across my brother and his friends, though they noticed it too late. I, however, couldn't help but miss it as it pattered across my face and chest. It was blood, thick and red, and they turned as a horror strode from the field of lush cornstalks. My mind hadn't done him justice. The corn man, or whatever he was, looked more like a terrible husk doll that you sometimes see at the farmer's market when Mom took us. It appeared to be woven together from corn husks and corn stalks and the silk tops of the plants. It was dirt and leaves and corn cobs and live plants. Its entire body seemed to move like a living vine. It moved with a complete form, its entire being, and it waded into Daryl and his friends like a force of nature. Clyde had turned to look at what had wetted him, and I saw that twisted gnarl of root and corn stalks slam into the side of his head. His neck audibly broke, bones poking out from his collar as he fell sideways into the corn. Daryl screamed, Kyle cursed loudly, and I stood rooted in fear as the corn man went about his work. No way, Daryl yelled, stepping back as he turned to face the creature. No friggin' way! It's real? Kyle asked. The creature momentarily stalled as it looked at them speculatively. No, I made it up. I made the whole thing up. It can't be real. It can't be real. It can't be. He died with that negation on his lips. The corn man extended his thick, rooted arm, and it grew as it coursed towards Daryl's head. Daryl's screams were cut off as the root covered his face, his throat bulging as it poured its roots and stalks down his throat. I could see his body twitching, his limbs convulsing as the corn man pumped his roots into him. My cheeks were wet again, my terror-fueled tears streaming down my face as Kyle made a run for it. He disappeared into the corn, just in time to miss the fate of his friend. Daryl's body erupted in a spray of corn stalks as they burst from him in a red spray of arterial blood. He crumpled, very dead, as his form was shredded. He lay in pieces, his body watering the corn just as he had said. I was resprayed with blood, this time being washed in the deluge, but I was still frozen with fear. My body had hit that point where it was numb, too scared to move, and as the corn man stalked in, I could hear my ragged breathing intensifying. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. I just knew that this was the time when my own blood would water the cornfields, just like Daryl's. He stood face to face with me, much like Mark had when he was pretending, and as the seconds spread out, I felt like my heart must surely stop, and I would die of fear. Then, to my amazement, the corn man spoke. "You have passed my test. You truly can do as the cornstalks can, and have earned a boon of me. What do you desire of the corn man?" I was speechless, my body unmoving, as I continued to stand like a statue before this hulking horror. His voice sounded like the whispering of wind through the cornstalks, and if I hadn't been frozen in fear, I would have shuddered out of my skin as his words hit me. He loomed over me, his body bathed in the blood of my brother and his friends, and I was left to shudder and shake as he stared at me. He cocked his head, his roots making a strange creaking noise as he studied me in my fear. Come now. There must be something you desire. Why else would you brave your death at the hands of the corn man, if not for a boon?" I looked up at him. Even hunkered down, he was taller than me, and my eyes streamed with tears, my body unable to move. "Very well. Know then that the corn man owes thee a boon, a favor as your people say, and he will be back to collect in time. Think well over your wishes, that my debt may be paid." Then he lumbered off after Kyle, his steps groaning as he moved, and I was left standing amidst the stalks. That's where they found me the next day. That's where they found me and what was left of Daryl, Mark, and Clyde. I was catatonic for days. I had remained still as a stone in the field all night, not daring to move as the fear held sway over me. Even when they called out to me, I couldn't answer them. My legs ached, my body cried out for rest, but my legs refused to unlock. My mother's arms were warm as they wrapped around me. I was cold, hungry, my throat like a desert, but I couldn't move or speak. They kept me in the hospital for weeks, trying to figure out what had happened to me. The police questioned me ceaselessly, being covered in my brother's blood like I was, but my mother ended every interview by telling them that it was pointless to question me. They assumed that I had watched the 4 boys being murdered, Kyle's remains found further out in the field, and I had been traumatized by the events. I stayed like that for almost 3 weeks, before waking up one day to find my arms and legs were ready to obey me again. The police came back to question me, but I told them that I had blacked the whole thing out, not wanting to ever speak of the horrible things that had happened in that field. I only tell you here, a decade later, to come to terms with what happened to me and try to put it behind me. That, and see if anyone else knows of the corn man and his ways. You see, he's come back over the years to collect on his favor. I still live with my mother, my body locking up sometimes when the fear takes over. Once a year, on the anniversary of my brother's death, he comes to ask if I'm ready to take his boon. Sometimes he appears in my room at night, sometimes outside my window, but he always speaks in that strange voice and asks if I'm ready to accept my favor. Every time I remain still, my body seizing up and my jaw locking. And every time, he goes away. I've gotten better at getting myself under control again. Last time I was only frozen for an hour, but I've had to go back to the hospital over the years when the catatonia reemerges. One day, I will be able to ask for something, so I never have to see him again. Until then, I suppose I'll be haunted by the visage of the corn man. Good evening, my little creeperonies. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Time to thank our sponsors again. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton Tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. Hey, Would you maybe like to join our spooky skeleton tier? Just $5 a month. You too can have your name read out at the end of every YouTube and TikTok I make. If you're in the mood for something a little more substantial, I've also got books available on Amazon. I've got 3 compilations now, and I've got 1 compilation of Stragview stories if you're into prison tales. And as always, we hope to see you next week for another story. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.
One more story, I think, and I've saved one of the best for last. Finishing out our sad spooky sandwich, let's hear about a man who keeps a vigil on some very strange ghosts at a local cemetery. Let's hear about the dancing ghosts of Habersham Cemetery.
I had never met the guy before that night. What my friends and I did was extremely foolish. Given the crowd we rolled with, it was fortunate that we didn't end up as ghosts ourselves. I was part of the goth scene in high school. These were the prime years of Hot Topic fashion, where every town had a garage band that played scene music, and every school had a little collection of black-clad figures who smoked out behind the gym. I was a poster child for goth culture. Eyeliner, hair like an oversprayed raven wing, fishnets, combat boots, the whole 9 yards. The school hated our little clique, mostly due to truancy and the little pile of butts we left out behind the gym, but we didn't care. It was all part of the aesthetic, right? October may have meant costumes and candy when we were younger, but now that we were older, October was 30 days of celebration. On any given afternoon, my friends and I could wander downtown and hear someone telling spooky stories on the corner, take part in a ghost tour, or listen to someone playing a saw or something spooky with scavenged instruments. Downtown had a sizable artistic scene, and October was also their month to cash in on the semi-spooky history of the town. Pinkerton Dock, the park where some witches had been burned, the old gallows by the courthouse, the Rikers Hotel, they all had a history of ghosts and spooky occurrences. Sometimes, we would just walk around in our dark clothes and heavy makeup, adding to the ambience. So, when the posters appeared at our favorite coffee shop, Dark Brew, announcing a Halloween concert for the local band Burning Ramses, we all planned to be there. We were sitting towards the back, the air heavy with the smell of clove cigarettes and the fruity smell of smuggled vodka, when the man in the vest suddenly approached our table. I was sitting with Catherine and Margot, Tobias and Clyde sitting on the other side, and we had just started discussing what we would do after the concert. Clyde thought that we should go to the old Leaback place, the most haunted spot in town, and see if we could spot some ghosts. Margot wanted to go drinking at Pinehurst Cemetery, something that was a shock to no one. Margot was already 3 sheets to the wind and seemed to be destined for a life of barely functional alcoholism. Tobias was just suggesting that maybe we could check out the trail on the next town over where those kids had been murdered back in the 80s, when the guy seemed to appear between he and Catherine before speaking up. It wouldn't have been so strange. The place was packed, but Cat and Tobias were sitting against the back wall. If you guys are looking for something spooky to do, you should come out to Habersham Cemetery with me. We all jumped and looked at him, clearly startled by his sudden appearance. He was older than we were, somewhere between 20 and 30, wearing dark jeans and a leather vest covered in patches from shows he'd been to. I didn't recognize any of the patches, but I thought I recognized the man. I'd seen him at shows before, one of those guys who likes to hover around the back, and the left side of his head had a weird burn on it, like someone had pressed his face against a radiator. That side was hairless, and he had swooped the rest of his corn silk hair over it to hide the spot. It drew more attention to it, ruining the attempt to hide it, and the longer I looked at him, the more he looked like a skeleton someone had squeezed into scene kid clothes. Hearing him talk now was a little odd. I had expected his voice to be something like a hiss or carry a stutter. We would all be surprised later that we hadn't just told him to leave, which would stick with me. We had been enchanted by him, held by some kind of glamour, and when Tobias asked what he meant, it seemed like he had only been waiting for someone to ask. Habersham Cemetery is supposed to be as old as the town itself. It's lost in the woods near Terry Mill, and I watched a corpse dance there last year. I leaned in to hear, wanting him to go on, but he stood up and pointed at the door with his thumb. I could tell you all about it, but why tell you when I can show you? It happens at midnight on Halloween night,
and if I want to see it, I need to get moving. You can come with me if you want. It's definitely something to see." He pushed past Catherine and headed for the door, clearly not caring if we followed him or not, and the 5 of us looked at each other in silent conference. It sounded fun, but none of us knew this guy. Clyde thought his name might be Steve, but he had never talked to him. Clyde was interested in seeing what was at the cemetery, and Tobias thought he had heard of the place before. "It's supposed to be wild, like it feels like there might be real magic there, I heard." After a short discussion, it was unanimously decided that we would follow him out there. Catherine added that there were 5 of us, and even if he was a creep, he didn't look very intimidating. The man was a scarecrow, and 5 older teens could easily jump him if he decided to get weird. So after we roused Margot and got her shakily to her feet, we all set out after the weird guy before he could get too far ahead. He looked up when we walked out, enjoying a cigarette on the sidewalk, and his smile was broad and genuine. "Glad you guys decided to join me. Looks like I might need a ride." He pointed to an empty parking spot nearby and explained how his van had been towed while he was inside. "Guess my tags were a little more expired than I thought. Think I could catch a ride with you guys? I don't mind hitchhiking back if you don't want to come back with me." This elicited a new huddle. I had a Ford Focus that would be lucky to hold 4 people, and Kat and Margot had ridden with me. Luckily, Clyde had a Jeep and figured he could easily put all 6 of us in the vehicle. We decided that Tobias and Catherine would sit on either side of this guy in the back, just to make sure he didn't try anything weird. Tobias was a softie, but he was nearly 6 feet tall, and was muscled through the shoulders from working on his dad's farm all his life. Catherine was a waif by comparison, but the whole group had seen her put guys twice her size on their asses more than once, and we felt confident that the 2 of them could keep the guy from getting too crazy. Nodding, we broke and told him he could ride in the back, as long as he could give us directions. He introduced himself as Steve, and took his seat graciously before telling Clyde to hop on the main road and head out of town. We rode in silence past the town sign, the silence getting awkward until Tobias finally couldn't take it anymore. "So, I don't think I've ever been to Habersham Cemetery. What's the deal with it?" "Habersham Cemetery is beautiful, but it's been kinda lost to time," Steve explained. "It's owned by the old Habersham family, though they're all gone now. They were dancers. Did you know that? Their whole family was in the ballet or the theater, until one day their bloodline just kinda dwindled out. The old cemetery is really the only sign that they were ever here at all. When I was in school, my friends and I would go out there to hang out a lot. My friend Trevor had discovered it as a kid, and we used to get drunk and smoke there whenever we all got together. It sounds weird, but that's where I got my first kiss, where I took my first drink, and the place I have the happiest memories of." "Why aren't these friends going out there with you then?" asked Kat, her tone not really accusing, but more curious than anything. "Oh, they just don't really hang out with me anymore. People get older, they kinda drift apart. Life happens and people grow separate. You guys will figure that out one day." At the time, I remember thinking this wouldn't happen to us, but everyone knows how that usually works out. For the moment, we were on an adventure, and that was what was important. Steve bumped Clyde's headrest softly, pointing towards an access road as it swam into the headlights, and he told him to take it. "It's at the end of the access road. It should only take about 10 minutes to get there from here." I checked my watch and saw that it was pushing 11. We should make it in plenty of time, but I hope this wasn't just a creative means to lure us out into the woods. This guy seemed at ease as he sat between Catherine and Tobias, but some people could turn on a dime like that. He could be as quiet as a mouse until he transformed into a lion and stabbed us all to death out there in the woods. The trees slid by in the soupy glass of Clyde's windshield, and as we came to the cul-de-sac at the end of the access road, Clyde slowed down and stopped in the middle. The area was open, carved out, and rolled smooth as they prepared to raise new houses here. At the moment, the pristine land just looked barren and lonely, and Clyde looked back at Steve to make sure this was the place. "It's in the woods behind this. Come on," he said, looking at his 2 bookends to see who would get out first. As it happened, Tobias climbed out first, and Steve followed him as Clyde turned off the Jeep and killed the headlights. It was dark, the moon little more than a silvery thought, but luckily Clyde had some flashlights in the back. Steve had his own headlamp in his back pocket, and as we dug out the lights, he slid it on and waited for us to get ready. Margot had sobered up a little and was complaining about how she didn't want to go tromping out into the woods at night.
We debated just leaving her there, but as Clyde slid an arm around her, she perked up and prepared to walk into the trees with him. Margot had a pretty obvious crush on Clyde, but she seemed the only one who hadn't guessed that Tobias would be more up Steve's alley. The only one who might have been more surprised to learn that was Clyde himself. Steve headed off into the woods as we checked our lights, his headlamp bobbing between the scrubby trees surrounded by flat and unnatural landscape. He called back to us, telling us to get the lead out if we wanted to see it, and we came along with our flashlights bobbing and Margot swaying as Clyde tried manfully to keep her upright. The night sounds around us seemed way louder than they had been in the city. The crickets chirped and reed happily. The bats tittered and flapped overhead. The frogs sounded off in the depths of the woods, and as the wind rustled, it sounded like the trees themselves were welcoming us. The leaves of last year rattled skeletally on the branches as they chimed in the winter, and the deeper we went, the more lonely the place seemed. It felt like we had entered the graveyard long before I saw the crumbling stone and iron walls that surrounded it. "Welcome to Habersham Cemetery," Steve said grandly. "Here lies the entirety of the Habersham line, save for the last 2 generations who are buried in Mount Christos. I've spent some of the best times of my life here, times I'll never recapture again." He checked his watch and beckoned us inside. Someone had set up a couch under the overhang of trees, and I had a sneaking suspicion I knew who it was. Margot flopped onto the old couch, sending up a cloud of dust and dead leaves, and Tobias sat gingerly beside her as he tested the old couch for bugs or rats. Clyde leaned against a gravestone, and Kat hopped up on a stone marker that was as big as a coffee table. Steve was looking out towards the middle, an area without markers that seemed marred by a few hasty little hillocks. I wondered again if this was the place he meant to kill us, maybe bury us in this long-forgotten graveyard. I doubted it, but it was a thought that wouldn't quite leave. I pushed it aside and went to stand near him, curious about why he had us all here in the first place. "Your van didn't really get towed, did it?" I asked. I expected he would lie, but he surprised me with his candor. "I wasn't as smooth with that one as I thought, was I?" "No. Truth is, I usually ask someone to take me out here. Sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a stranger, and sometimes I just end up walking. Make no mistake, though, I end up at this cemetery before midnight every year." "And how many Halloweens has that been?" He seemed to consider, but I didn't think he really had to think too hard about it. "About 11. I think maybe this one might be number 12. "And why is this so important that you walk here every Halloween?" I had gotten past the idea that he meant to kill us, but I was still curious about the locale and the reason for coming here. Surely we weren't going to see corpses dance out here. "Well, I think I got time for a story. You see, I used to come out here when I was in middle school with my friends. Davy had found the place, and when he showed Heather, Mark, and I, we thought it was about the coolest place ever. We brought Sandra out here when she and Mark met in high school. By that point, it was our regular hangout spot. We used to come out here every Halloween and tell scary stories and eat candy, drink beer, just relax, you know. I had my first time on that grave marker your friend's sitting on, and afterwards I looked at Heather and knew that she was the only girl I ever wanted to be with." He looked wistfully at the old hillocks, and I realized that there were 4 of them out there. The thought piqued my curiosity, but it also rekindled a little of my mistrust. "Then one night, I messed it all up." An alarm went off on his watch, and he looked down as he wrung his hands. "Any minute now." He watched the mounds in the middle of the boneyard, continuing his story as he waited for the show to begin. "We were coming back from a show one night, all of us drunk or stoned or some combination of the two. A deer ran out in front of my van, and I swerved to miss it. The van skidded, and I went off into the ravine. It wasn't very deep, but I think I was the only one wearing a seatbelt. My friends bounced around in the van like popcorn. When we came to rest at the bottom, I slipped off for a while. When I came to, 3 of them were already dead. I sometimes wish that Heather had been one of them, but it did mean that I got to say goodbye." I heard something rustle out in the graveyard and looked at the 4 mounds that Steve was marking so attentively. I had a burn on the side of my face from something. I was never quite sure what, but it was bad enough that I'd never forget it. As bad as it was, though, Heather was worse. She was beaten all to hell.
laying on what would have been the ceiling and pulling in breath like she had broken ribs and they were in her lungs. She was looking at me, and when I saw her, I unclipped my seatbelt and fell to my knees beside her. Despite her protest, I pulled her onto my lap, and as she lay dying in my arms, I could hear her whispering something again and again. I leaned in close, just as the blue and white lights reflected inside the van, as she whispered her request one final time before passing on. I hardly heard him as he laid it all out. The earth around the mounds had begun to shift, the earth running in rivulets. A dark finger had wormed its way from the closest grave, and an arm was inching out to join it. The top of a head appeared from the ground, and the blonde hair was ragged like old yarn. Steve grinned as he looked at the face below the hair, sniffling a little as she pulled herself free, revealing a corpse in a black dress. The other three wore formal wear, suits or dresses that looked like they'd never seen more than a week above ground. I took a step away, feeling like someone stuck in a George Romero film as I watched them shuffle out like sleepwalkers. "What in the hell?" I asked, and I heard Kat squeak in uncharacteristic fear as she nearly tumbled off the marker stone. Clyde had taken a step towards me, Margot clutching at his arm as she screamed like a fire alarm. Clyde was clutching at something as Margot clutched at him, and I could see that it was a jagged piece of gravestone. Steve stepped in front of him, waving his arms as he begged for him not to hurt them. "They won't hurt anybody. They've never hurt anybody. Just watch." As if they had only been waiting for him to speak, all four took up poses and began to rotate in a slow circle. They moved to a tune that only they could hear, and they turned and moved like dancers caught in a familiar bit of choreography. They were helpless, moved by something unearthly, and their dance had turned into something grotesque as I noticed their injuries. Their clothes hid the bones that must be poking through their skin, but I could clearly see that one of the boys, a big blonde one with football player shoulders, had a broken leg that he was dancing on heedlessly. One of the girls had a head that looked mushy, and the one that I had first seen come out of the ground had a bob to her neck that made it seem like it no longer wanted to support her. The four moved with graceless precision, spinning as they moved in a circle, grasping hands as they came together in the center. "What the hell is this?" Tobias asked, sounding angry as he got off the couch and walked towards Steve. "Dancing corpses, just as I told you." "Yeah, but we didn't expect to actually see them. We thought, Clyde stammered. "Thought what? That I was putting you on? That I was messing with a group of kids? That I meant to drag you out here so I could kill you or rob you? Then why did you come out here at all? Why would you come out here with a complete stranger if you didn't believe what I was saying?" We couldn't really argue with that. He was right. We'd gone into the woods with a perfect stranger. And for what? Had any of us really believed that we would see dancing corpses? We knew that such things didn't really happen, but here we were, watching four rotting corpses dance like tired ballet performers. Clyde went back to the couch, Margot clutching his arm, and we all sat in rapture as we watched their performance. As they turned and moved, I could see that Steve had eyes only for the blonde with the broken neck. He followed her as she spun, smiling whenever her eyes happened upon his. It was hard not to imagine that her rotten lips twisted a little in pleasure, and I felt like I already knew who she was before I asked. "Heather?" I asked, but he put a hand up to stop me. After the dance is over. I'll finish the story then, but for now, just let me watch." I nodded and turned back to see the corpses leaping like deer, their legs groaning in agony as their bones tried to hold them up. Suddenly there were others in the old boneyard, alabaster spirits, their bodies too decomposed to rise and dance, spun around the shambling dancers. Their movements were expert, their bright leotards and costumes from 1,000 different performances, and they complemented the dancing bodies expertly. The dance was one they knew, a dance they had all danced for generations, and as his watch beeped again, all the dancers suddenly stopped and turned to look at us. It was strange having the eyes of the living dead on you, and as they all bowed politely, the ghosts dissipated in a shower of stars. The four corpses, however, simply fell to the ground and moved no more. "Shame it only lasts 15 minutes, Steve sighed. "Okay,
I waited till the end of the dance. Now, how about you fill me in on the rest, I said, my curiosity getting the better of me. Sure, but first I need to put my old friends back to bed. He went into the woods and came back with 4 shovels. It'll go faster if you help me, but I understand if you'd rather not. I took the offered shovel, and Clyde reached for one as well. Tobias took some coaxing, but he finally grabbed the other when Catherine sighed and went to take it. Margot just sat on the couch, her eyes closed and her breathing gentle. Clyde told us that it had all been a little too much for her, and he'd watched her faint just as the dead people started to dance. Kat came over to help us anyway, and as we worked, Steve finished his story, bringing the others to speed before continuing. Heather said she wanted to be buried here, but it wasn't the first time she'd asked it. We were in the graveyard on the last Halloween of her life, watching the ghosts dance and twirl, when she asked me to bury her here when she died. I looked at her oddly, asking why she would want to be buried here, and she told me that she liked the idea of dancing with all the ghosts once a year. Coming back once a year to dance with all my friends sounds like a wonderful way to spend my death. The others must have heard her because they decided they wanted to be buried here too. By the end of the night, all of us had made a pact. We would all make sure that we were buried here, the last one alive making sure that the rest were buried here, one way or another. He rubbed the sweat off his forehead, climbing out of the hole as he prepared to put his friend back in it. None of them thought they'd have to make good on that pact less than a year later. No teenager who's barely in their senior year thinks about their death as more than a distant idea. And suddenly it fell to me to make sure their wishes were honored. Their parents wouldn't hear a word I had to say. They blamed me for their children's death. I was drunk when we crashed after all, and I was barred from their funerals. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew that if I ever wanted to see Heather again, I would need to fulfill my promise to them. You didn't, I said, kind of wishing I hadn't asked. Fortunately, they were buried in 2 different cemeteries. If I'd spent 12 hours in one, someone would have likely caught me for sure. Heather came first, then Mark. Then I got Davy and Sandra from the Presbyterian church, just as the sun came up. I had borrowed my dad's old truck and parked right around where your friend parked his Jeep. I brought them out here one at a time and buried them in the place they loved so much. I put them to rest where I knew they could rest easy, and when it was all done, I washed the evidence out of my dad's truck and parked it right where he had left it. The police came to question me, of course, but I was careful not to let anyone see me enter or leave the cemetery, or leave any evidence behind. In the end, they had to let me go, and I marked the days until Halloween. He lifted Heather into his arms, looking at her rotting face with love. The first time I saw her dance, I was nearly scared shitless. I was out here drinking, keeping up the traditions that we had always held, but I don't think I actually thought they would dance. They weren't Habershams, and I would see nothing but the usual spooks as they capered. When they all drugged themselves up, I spilled my beer and thought they'd come to get me for disturbing their graves. When they began to dance, though, I was so happy. I felt that happiness falter, though, when I realized what it meant. He laid her in the ground again, and as he began to cover her with soil, he looked back with the saddest smile I'd ever seen. It meant that there was no one to lay me to rest in the cemetery when my time comes. I'll never dance with her, never be with her again, unless I have the courage to bury myself alive when the time comes. We were all gathered around the last grave, all of us besides Margot, and as he came out of the hole, he thanked us for helping him. Normally I'd offer you a beer, but I'm afraid I forgot to buy any this time. Clyde told him he thought it might be time for him to take Margot home, and Tobias said he needed to get home for chores the next day. Clyde had Margot over one shoulder, still snoring happily, and I saw Kat slide her hand into Tobias's as they left. I asked Steve if he needed a ride, but he just shook his head and leaned on his shovel. I think I'll stay for a little while. I prefer to spend Halloween with my friends, and I think we've got some catching up to do. We saw Steve a few more times over the years, and unfortunately his predictions had been true. Tobias and Catherine dated until college, when they both got accepted into separate schools. Clyde and Margot were an item for a while, mostly to get his strictly religious parents off his back, until he finally came out and moved to the Midwest somewhere with his secret boyfriend. I got tired of being used as a shoulder to cry on by Margot and decided to go to college in the next state. I kept in touch with all of them, but we were never together again the way we were in high school. 10 years after I'd seen the dancing ghosts, I happened to be home for Halloween. I decided it might be nice to see them again. Maybe I wanted to prove that I'd actually seen it the first time. Maybe I just wanted to make sure the old place was still there. Maybe I just wanted to see Steve again. Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling up into the cul-de-sac about 11 o'clock that night, locking my car and walking into the woods. The area had grown back up. The lots had been cleared and never used. I had thought it might be hard to find a second time, but the trees looked exactly the same as I remembered them. When the gates loomed up, I saw they hadn't changed either, and I could already see the sagging old couch as it sat beside the fence. I expected that Steve would come wandering up at any minute, but as the time ticked closer to midnight, I figured this would be one performance he would miss. As I sat on the couch, my watch chimed midnight, and the earth began to stir. The original 4 corpses were still there, but they were mostly skeletons now. Their bones were broken and cracked, but they still danced as they had on that night a decade ago. They groaned and creaked as they danced and spun, but the corpse who crawled out of Heather's grave looked a little fresher. He was wearing the same black vest I'd seen him in that night, and though dirty, I could still make out some of the band patches. The ghosts joined them, and I marveled once again at the intricate dance they moved within. I didn't know how long he had been there, but it appeared that Steve had found the courage he was talking about to chase the woman he loved. When they flopped to the ground, I got up and found the shovels again. It appeared they would need someone else to lay them to rest this year. I wondered who would put them in the ground next year, or whether they would simply bake in the sun the day after their performance. I think maybe that was when I decided it was time to move back home. I could do worse than teach English in my old high school, drink coffee at the old coffee shop, and watch the corpses dance on Halloween. Who knows, maybe I'll even find some teenagers to invite out here one night, so they can have something to remember when their high school days are behind them. Maybe they too will come back to see one last performance by the Habersham dancers.
And just like that, our stories have come to an end for another day. Oh, but don't worry. You didn't think this was the end, did you? We'll be having holiday spooky horrors right up until it's time to get your own little goblins out for some tricking and treating. Expect to see cozy horrors all the way up to the 31st, and I hope we'll see you back again tomorrow for more spooky tales with your good friend, Dr. Plague. Until then, this is Dr. Plague wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.